Stephen Olshansky's story is an incredible one, but unfortunately, one that has a tragic end. But before we get into that, we need to understand the Continental Divide Trail a little bit more. The Continental Divide Trail makes up the final long-distance path of the Triple Crown of hiking trails as the longest of the three. The Appalachian Trail covers 14 states, is the shortest as just over 2,174 miles, and the most popular of the long-distance hiking trails. Next, the Pacific Crest Trail spans over 3 states and 2 countries for a total of 2,650 miles, starting in Southern California at the Mexico border and ending at the Canadian border with 3 states in between. The last of these long-distance trails is called the Continental Divide Trail and is the longest at 3,028 miles, starting in northern Mexico through 5 states in the Midwestern United States and going into Canada. Each trail will hold its own claim to fame for hikers, scenic views, and possible once-in-a-lifetime wildlife encounters that make this trail popular with all hikers. The Appalachian Trail is known for its beauty and having a lot more foot traffic than the other 2 trails. The most difficult trail is the Continental Divide Trail, as it isn't clearly marked. Restock points are farther apart. Only around 85% of the trail is finished, and being the longest, the CDT cuts through some of the roughest terrain in Triple Crowners. There are also large animals to contend with on the Continental Divide, such as mountain lions, bobcats, wolves, coyotes, venomous snakes, grizzly and black bears, all take residence of the states that the trail runs through. These animals often make appearances to visitors and scare the boots off most inexperienced hikers and travelers. When traveling this trail, you're more apt to encounter one of America's top 5 predators than you are another hiker, as this trail only sees an estimated 100 through hikers per year and 500 or so day-use hikers. However, most people that traverse this trail have said they've seen at least 1 hiker per day while on it. Being that the CDT isn't clearly marked in some areas, especially in New Mexico where visitors use designated game trails to facilitate the hike, and because it isn't finished, it would be easy to become lost. Another challenging aspect of this particular trail is that it cuts through some of the coldest and inclement-prone states in the lower 48, particularly Colorado, which gets hundreds of inches of snow in the winter, is flash flood prone in the summer, and receives the most snowfall in the lower 48. Therefore, it is important to gauge the time of year to best facilitate a through hike, and even day hiking can be treacherous in the summer during monsoon season flash floods. Stephen Olshansky was an avid outdoorsman that had traveled the Continental Divide Trail as a through hiker a couple of times and knew it pretty well. His story is a cautionary tale not to become complacent with the terrain and weather when hiking. On November 14, 2015, 59-year-old Stephen Olshansky of Boynton Beach, Florida, was reported missing by friends and family members after a severe snowstorm and weeks without any word from Steve. Olshansky, or the Otter, which was his trail name, was hiking the Continental Divide Trail for the second time and had hiked all 3 of the United States long-distance trails multiple times. This guy was very experienced. It earned him the rare and coveted title of the Triple Crowner. Otter's hike started out in the Coombers Pass, Continental Divide on the Colorado-New Mexico border, where he was dropped off by friends at the trailhead. He had mailed a restock package for himself to Ghost Ranch, but never arrived to pick it up. Through hikers will often mail supply packages to themselves while hiking these trails, so they have food and other supplies for their journey. Otter's projected route was southbound on the Continental Divide Trail, towards Abiquiu, New Mexico. He was a very experienced hiker and had completed multiple hikes around the United States in the past several years. In fact, just last year, in 2014, Olshansky had completed the Continental Divide Trail from Mexico to Canada without major incidents twice. 6 long months passed with no word from Stephen. Now, friends and family had reported him missing back in December when they had not heard from him in a couple of weeks. The official search started at the New Mexico/Colorado border, where Olshansky started his journey. Eventually, authorities expanded their search area to other parts of New Mexico, and the New Mexico State Police began asking the public's assistance in looking for the missing hiker. Reports trickled in from various parts of the state that there was sightings in Carson National Forest and the surrounding areas, but these were either other hikers or men that resembled him. 6 months later, in May of 2016, the body of Stephen Olshansky would be found by another hiker not far from where he had begun his journey. It would take authorities another 2 days to reach the remains, as snow still covered the area. Olshansky, veteran hiker, outdoor enthusiast, and beloved brother, had passed away from exposure and starvation. The following is a recollection of his heartbreaking story. Stephen Olshansky was an avid hiker and loved being outdoors, exploring new areas, and had actually completed each of the through trails in the continental United States a total of at least twice, each of the Appalachian Trail and Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail. His last known address was from Boynton Beach, Florida, a world away from the area where Stephen would be found in a latrine holed up from a snowstorm that had blanketed the forest floor. He hadn't planned on hiking the Continental Divide Trail that year, instead choosing to backpack up the west coast, eventually ending up in northern Idaho where he had heard there was a new trail, a friend recalled in an interview in an Outside article. However, Otter changed his mind at the last minute, choosing to hike from Colorado/New Mexico border up to Montana, then doing the southern portion of the trail last. But first, he would need to go retrieve a box he had mailed to himself, right in New Mexico, which is south from where he had started. This is what had led him to Carson National Forest. Winter would come and claim that area early that year, covering the ground in a deep, sparkling blanket of white snow. In a journal that Olshansky kept of his adventures, he wrote, "I was post-holing a lot, shin to knee deep above 9,000 feet in southern Colorado's San Juan Range. Post-holing is when a hiker sinks in the snow and leaves a hole resembling that of a post hole. The San Juan Range of mountains in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, join up to the Rocky Mountains and can be tough to hike in their own right." Olshansky had completed this hike as a southbound hiker in late spring when the snow is still stable and compacted enough to walk on. But this year, in 2015, the snow was falling early and fast. Friends later recalled that Otter wasn't in a rush to get on the trail. He spent time with friends throughout October, even enjoying camping a trail angel's backyard. Trail angels are people that help hikers along their way with shelter, food, and water. Often they will also help maintain the trails. Before heading out on the ill-fated hike, Otter called another of his friends and asked for a tent that had a wood stove included. The friend obliged, sending it out to him. He had tested it out in the backyard where he was staying right before he parted for the trail. The day Otter left for the trail, it was a clear 50-degree day, perfect for a hike. Ben Whitting had taken Olshansky to the trailhead where he had asked Stephen to call him when he reached Ghost Ranch, which was south around 70 miles. The men waved goodbye, and Whitting watched his friend walk down the snowy trail. 2 weeks had passed without any word from Otter. At first, nobody was concerned as Otter had hiked these trails time and time again. In his journal, he told of his horrendous mistake of choosing to hike the Continental Divide starting in November. It read, "I immediately began to suffer from terrible weakness. When I stood up, I felt faint. At this point, Otter believed he had come down with the flu while staying at the Witter residence. When he felt better, the weather still wasn't cooperating, even dumping an additional foot of snow on the only patch of dry land he could find after wading through waist-deep snow and somewhat still in the same area where he had begun the hike. At this point, he tried to make it back to the Witter place, but it took him 12 hours to go 1 mile. He turned back to his shelter, barely making it. He was sick again and had no emergency locator with him, as he had chosen to go without it. On a short video that Otter made about his predicament, it shows a tent surrounded by waist-deep snow all around him. He spoke of having little food and trying to hike out, but there was nowhere for him to go. The Continental Divide Trail was completely covered with a fresh layer of snow, and the Continental Divide Road that leads to a campground was also covered. He spoke of hoping a snowmobile would come through, and if not, his friend Whitting told him that if he hadn't heard from Otter in 10 days, they would come looking for him. "I hope he's a man of his word," Olshansky told the camera as he panned back and forth showing the snow surrounding him. He was totally boxed in, had no cell service, no location device, and the weather was approaching winter with every passing day. The temperature was dipping below single digits at night with highs in the 20s during the day. He wrapped up the video by stating this: "I really rolled the dice and I lost. I need a miracle right now." Another storm blew in just a day after the first video he made. An additional foot of snow fell, stopping any plans of moving shelter locations. From November 19th through December 1st, Otter was stuck sheltering in places storm systems passed through, back to back, dropping several feet of fresh snow. Having to not only contend with the weather and dwindling food supply, the now stranded hiker was now suffering from the first stages of frostbite on his hands and toes. Back in civilization, there was a snowmobile outfitter taking patrons on tours of the backcountry as these storm systems were producing enough snow to start the season early that year. Tragically, the guides never went far enough into the wilderness to observe Steve. Journal entries for this period find Otter in surprisingly good spirits, although the precariousness of his dire situation could be heard in entries from each passing day. He made an SOS signal in the snow, hoping passing planes could see it, and also had built makeshift snowshoes out of branches, hoping to use them to escape the area where he had become marooned. He wrote, "The wind picked up and a big system blew in. It snowed and blew for a full week, and during that time I tried to build snowshoes, made a big help in the snow, and hoped somebody would fly over. I really thought they would figure this out, but I can't figure out why they didn't. It's disappointing." The days slowly trickled by. No snowmobiles, no planes. In his next video, you could see him melting snow on his stove and hear him talking about collecting wood for heat. His voice sounded utterly defeated. At this point, Otter had to make a decision as he couldn't stay where he was, and it was obvious that rescue wasn't coming. In his journal, he referred to this move as the biggest decision of his life. As Oscar saw it, his choices were to either stay in place and hope for rescue. He could try to walk east or west on the snowshoes he had used material from his own clothing to make, but knowing the fresh powder would prove difficult to stand on, as it was notoriously soft enough to fall through, or he could travel south into the low country towards a campground where there was possibly less snow. Being familiar with the campground area and having once slept in a latrine on site, this option was chosen. Otter packed up camp and headed south. His next journal entry was hopeful but had an undertone of foreboding to it. He wrote, "Took a lot of courage to pack up that day. I hiked over 200 yards and bent over from total exhaustion in the waist-deep snow. I looked back at that place where I had spent 17 days. Safe but in a coffin. A few steps, bend over, it took all day. I could not go one step further and was about to just sleep in the snow, and I looked to the left and I saw the bathroom. I squeezed inside, the icebox shivering. Got into my sleeping bag, cranked up the stove for a hot drink." Back in Chama, the Whittings were becoming more concerned with each passing day. They hadn't heard from Otter in weeks. They logged onto Facebook and found the CDT 15 page where hikers can go to keep in touch with friends and family while traveling on the Continental Divide Trail. Several of Otter's friends were members of the page, and this made getting the word out about his disappearance easier. By the next day, November 30th, the community was abuzz with Otter's plight, and people began contacting authorities in New Mexico. The first person they reached out to was Bob Rogers of the New Mexico Search and Rescue Team, telling him what was going on. The same day, Neil Olshansky also reached out to Rogers, worried that he hadn't heard from his brother, Stephen, in weeks. Knowing they were behind the 8 ball, Rogers alerted the New Mexico State Police, and immediately, officers were boots on the ground. interviewing people as to the last time Stephen Olshansky was seen or heard from, which was when the Whittings had dropped him off at the Cumbers Pass. Knowing his destination, Detective Jolene Jones of the New Mexico State Police made contact with Ghost Ranch to inquire about the care package Otter had sent to himself, only to learn it had never been claimed. The food had begun to rot inside, so staff members at the ranch opened the box and discovered most of the food was bad. The search area was daunting. As Otter informed friends, he planned to deviate from the trail, big mistake, to hike the dirt roads and game trails instead. A search was scheduled for December 10th. Planes, a search and rescue team, and helicopters fought 40-mile-per-hour winds, snow, drifts, and freezing temperatures as they searched over 300 square miles of the Carson National Forest. But to no avail. The tragedy is that one of the planes flew right over the latrine where missing Stephen was sleeping. As day 27 came and passed, a journal entry read, "I gave up on being rescued. Built a pair of skis to hold me up on the snow. Determined, I skied out to a cloudy day. The skis were fashioned out of tin and wire from a building he had burnt down, thinking the smoke would attract attention. It is thought that he skied east toward Forest Road 87. Had he stayed on that trajectory, he would have eventually ended up at Highway 285, which is a heavily trafficked highway. But after surviving a bad fall and narrowly escaping serious injury from the sharp tin, Otter started heading back to the shelter he had made for himself, exhausted and completely defeated. But just as those feelings really sunk in, he spotted a rescue plane headed right for him. He was out in the open and thought they saw him as they turned around and flew over the same area again. Otter was waving his arms wildly, hoping they had seen him, praying for a miracle. This changed his plans of going back to the shelter, and he decided to stay where he was in hopes rescuers would be there the next day. But they never came, because they never saw him. I skied a couple of miles, collapsed in the snow, made camp in the deep snow and wind. No sleep all night long. That night, I knew I wouldn't make it, so I made the tough decision to ski back. I would have died out there, he wrote in his journal. Having returned to the latrine that had become his shelter, Otter had found some oats when he burned down the shed, undoubtedly food for horses that he could cook and eat. My gut says they didn't see me. If they don't show up, I'm doomed. There's been a day between with snow and wind where they couldn't get in. Snowed last night. Hope for a clearing. Hoping. Come on, rescuers, this is the most agonizing day. It's all come down to this. He wrote as he ate his cache of oats. As the search continued for Otter, yet another tragic twist of fate would cause the search to focus in Grants, New Mexico, where missing persons posters were placed by Stephen's sister. A man fitting the description of missing hiker had walked into a ranger station asking for directions to a post office and nearby hotel. The ranger manning the desk didn't ask for the man's identification, but when the stranger said he had started his hike in November, the ranger instantly made the connection and mistakenly assumed he must be Stephen, the missing hiker from northern New Mexico. The tragedy worsened when someone wrote on the Facebook page for Stephen, "OMG, I just heard from a local rescue that you are safe and you are in our area. We are so grateful, and if you need our help in any way, just call." Up to this point, Otter's case had been classified as a search and rescue case, but after the false sighting and post on Facebook, the case was reclassified as a missing person, meaning that they assumed that he had been found alive, but his exact whereabouts were still unknown. Even with this information, Otter's friends were still unconvinced the stranger in Grants was his friend, because they knew that Otter knew where the post office was and that he would never sleep in a hotel, as he always chose to either stay in a tent or with trail angels. Witter made a Facebook post asking someone for help searching the local area where he had left Otter, and was also trying to scramble a snowmobile to reach these snow-covered places where they wouldn't be able to traverse them on foot or by wheeled vehicle. No one ever reached out to the friends. The snowmobile group that was in the area never saw the post asking for help. It's a shame because we're here, right near the campground's owner of the snowmobile tours after learning of the tragedy. As Christmas came, Friends drove to Cumbres Pass and hiked a few hundred yards in where the snow was impassable. They thought to themselves, if Otter was out there, there was no way he was still alive. But they were wrong. While the search for him was winding down, Otter continued to journal. Some days he was upbeat and other days he was depressed. It was on one of the depressed days that he decided to write his goodbyes and end his misery. He addressed each of his friends by name and wrote them a short message. One reading, "To all of you, get as much joy out of the rest of your lives as you can." Otter tried several ways to end his suffering, but none worked. He was simply too weak to carry snow for water. This left him wondering just how long he had left. How long can humans last in these conditions? I once heard 3 to 5 days without water and a month without food. But what if 3 meals a day of horse oats? Don't know. He dreamed of pizza throughout the day. Otter had been fighting off hunger and dehydration for weeks now, but the most pressing issue was frostbite on his feet. Besides water and oatmeal, my biggest problem is my toes. I'm trying to never let them get cold in the first place, because if they do, it's painful and it takes hours to warm them up, he would write in his journal. His thoughts turned to the 2 lakes near his shelter and the fish/fresh water that was beneath the ice. Planning on building a fire to melt the ice, Otter quickly realized how much energy that would take, and he just didn't have the stamina it would require. January brought more setbacks with raging winter storms that dumped several more feet of snow. At this point, his journaling had tapered off and was depressed in nature. My life is over. No opportunity to change things. Very sad, he wrote in a moment of despair. By his journaling, Otter had food through February but was growing weaker by the hour. By late February, he was too weak to stand to fetch snow to melt. His last journal entry read, "I never ever fit in. Not from 4 years old till now. Nowhere except maybe hiking community, 5th grade, bullied terribly, left scar for life. I was crushed beyond words. So unhappy we moved away from woods. I ran away, hitchhiked across the country. I discovered another world that forever changed my life. Got stoned first time at 16, was the best thing ever, escaped reality, pain for the first time. Went hiking out west on PCT, got laid first time. Looks like I'm going to die of dehydration, no flowing water, can't keep up. This is so intense and so sad, I'm powerless, getting weaker, been 50 below just laying around in the sack, losing track of days, dream of food all day. Boy, do I have regrets." On May 10th, 2016, Ian Dirtwolf Crombie was a northbound hiker coming through New Mexico on the Continental Divide Trail when he came upon the campground. He saw a pair of homemade skis outside and wondered if a hiker had made those the year before. Happy to see a latrine, he made his way over, and on the door was a note scratched into the paint that read, "There's a dead human body inside, bathroom locked." It is that of Stephen Olshansky, aka the Otter. Please notify authorities immediately. No joke, thank you. In 2 days, authorities from Chama, New Mexico, will learn of the discovery, and on May 15th, 2016, descended on the campground to retrieve the remains of Stephen. A memorial service was held as his friends and family celebrated the amazing life of a rare triple crowner, a friend, brother, and all-around amazing guy. May he forever rest in peace, and his adventure and struggles will never be forgotten. This video, the time it took to research, script, and record it, goes out to his friends and family.